The hunt. In the storm. The night was thick with rain, the sky a swirling cauldron of black clouds. Thunder rumbled overhead, and jagged bolts of lightning cut through the darkness, briefly illuminating the dense, tangled forest below. The rain came down in torrents, drumming against the leaves, turning the ground to mud, and filling the air with a steady roar. The world seemed to close in, becoming small and claustrophobic, as if the storm itself had trapped them in this living nightmare. Sheriff Tom Harper gripped the steering wheel of his patrol truck, his knuckles white with tension. His windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the relentless downpour. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, his eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the rain-streaked glass. In the back seat, Mike, the young deputy, sat rigid, his eyes wide and fearful. Behind them, 2 other police vehicles followed, their lights flashing through the sheets of rain, the beams of their headlights barely piercing the darkness. "We've got to find it," Harper growled, his voice filled with a mix of anger and fear. "That thing killed Jonas Creed. It tore him apart like he was nothing. We can't let it get away." The radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, we're not sure what we're dealing with here," came the shaky voice of Deputy Harris from one of the trailing cars. "Are you sure? Are we sure it's a werewolf?" Sheriff Harper took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing. "What else could it be?" he snapped. "You saw what it did to the town, what it did to Creed. It's out there, and we're going to put it down before it tears this place apart." He glanced at Mike, who was clutching his shotgun so tightly his hands were trembling. "Stay sharp, kid," Harper said, trying to sound confident. "It's just a big animal. We'll find it, and we'll take it down." But deep down, Harper knew better. He had seen the aftermath. Jonas's broken body, the look in his eyes just before the end. This was no ordinary animal. It was something darker, something far more dangerous. They reached the edge of the woods, where the dense trees loomed like a wall of shadows. Harper killed the engine, and the men piled out of their vehicles, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The rain was cold, soaking them to the bone within seconds. The thunder boomed above them, and the wind howled through the branches, making the trees sway like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. "Fan out," Harper ordered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Stay close. Keep your radios on. If you see anything at all, call it in. We don't take any chances." The men nodded, their faces grim and tense. They moved into the woods, their boots squelching in the mud, their flashlights sweeping through the underbrush. The trees were thick, the branches low, creating a maze of shadows and shifting shapes. Every step felt like a struggle, the mud pulling at their feet, the rain blinding them. Suddenly, a branch snapped somewhere in the darkness. Everyone froze, flashlights swinging toward the sound. The rain drummed harder, the wind howling through the trees, masking any noise. Harper felt a cold sweat on his forehead, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to steady his breathing, to keep his fear in check. "Did anyone see that?" Harris's voice crackled over the radio, tinged with panic. "No, just keep moving," Harper replied, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Eyes open, stay alert." They pushed deeper into the woods, the shadows growing thicker, the rain louder, the air colder. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves set their nerves on edge. Harper could feel it. A presence, something watching them, stalking them from just beyond the edge of the light. Then another sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The men stopped, their flashlights swinging wildly, trying to pinpoint the source. Harper's heart skipped a beat. "Stay together," he shouted. "Don't split up." But it was too late. The werewolf struck with blinding speed, a blur of fur and fangs leaping from the shadows. It crashed into the nearest officer, dragging him screaming into the darkness. The others barely had time to react before the night was filled with the sounds of tearing flesh and desperate, choked cries for help. "Jesus Christ," Mike yelled, his voice breaking with fear. He fired his shotgun blindly into the darkness, the flash of the muzzle lighting up the rain for a brief moment. But the werewolf was already gone, vanished back into the woods. "We've got to get out of here," another officer shouted, his eyes wide with terror. "It's hunting us." "No," Harper barked. "We hold our ground. It wants us to panic. Stay together, damn it." But panic was already setting in. One by one, the men began to scatter, their flashlights bobbing through the trees, their voices rising in frantic fear. The werewolf moved like a shadow, darting from one target to the next, taking them down with savage efficiency. Another officer screamed, his body pulled into the darkness, his flashlight falling to the ground, the beam pointing upward as the rain poured down. Harper's breath came in short, ragged gasps. He could feel the terror clawing at his throat, his hands trembling despite his best efforts to stay calm. Damn it all," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He turned to Mike, who was standing frozen, his eyes wide with fear. "Mike, stay close to me," he said, his voice softer now. "We're gonna make it out of this. Just keep your eyes on me." But before Mike could respond, a massive shadow loomed behind him. Harper's eyes widened in horror as he saw the werewolf, its eyes glowing red in the dark, its fangs bared in a feral grin. "Mike! Behind you!" Harper screamed, but it was too late. The werewolf pounced, its claws ripping into Mike's back, tearing through flesh and bone. Mike's scream was cut short as the beast dragged him into the darkness, his flashlight tumbling from his hand, the beam flickering and dying in the mud. Harper fired his rifle, but the shots went wide, lost in the rain and wind. No, damn it," he shouted, feeling the panic rise in his chest. He backed away, his eyes darting left and right, searching for any sign of the creature. The woods seemed to close in around him, the darkness becoming deeper, the rain louder, drowning out everything but the sound of his own heartbeat. He could feel it now, the terror, the realization that he was the last one left, the prey. He tried to steady his breath, to calm his racing heart, but it was no use. The werewolf was out there somewhere, watching, waiting. He heard a faint rustle to his left and spun around, rifle at the ready, but saw nothing. The darkness pressed in closer, the rain like cold needles against his skin. Then a whisper of movement behind him, a soft crunch of leaves. He turned, his rifle raised, but before he could react, the werewolf was upon him, slamming him to the ground with a force that knocked the wind from his lungs. Harper felt the cold, wet ground against his back, the rain washing over his face. He looked up, and there it was, the werewolf, towering over him, its eyes burning with a malevolent light, its fangs dripping with rain and blood. Harper felt his breath catch in his throat, his fingers tightening around the trigger, but he knew it was too late. He was the last, and he was prey. The beast lunged, and the last thing Harper saw was the flash of lightning illuminating the werewolf's snarling face as it descended upon him, the roar of thunder drowning out his final scream. The storm raged on, but in the woods all was silent. The hunt was over, and the darkness had won. Eldritch stood beside Isolde, watching her hands weave through the air with precise, practiced movements. Each gesture left a trail of faint, glowing symbols hanging in the damp, misty night. The ancient stones around them seemed to hum with a quiet energy, resonating with the spell she was channeling. The air felt thick, charged with a power that made Eldridge's skin tingle. "They will buy us some time," Isolde muttered, her voice low and focused, her eyes never leaving the patterns her hands created. Not much, but hopefully enough to complete this spell. Eldridge's dark eyes followed the glow of her movements. He could feel the tension in the air, the urgency. He stepped closer, his long coat fluttering slightly in the night wind. "So why is this Lycan different from the rest?" he asked, his voice smooth but curious. "Why did you trap it instead of just killing it?" Isolde's hands paused for a moment, her gaze hardening as she spoke. "We tried," she replied, her voice filled with a mixture of frustration and fear. "It just wouldn't die. An old warlock called Malakar used the Lycan curse and added dark magic. We hunted down and slew many of its pack, but each time we killed one, this one seemed to grow stronger. It was as if it was absorbing the power of the fallen Lycans, feeding on their essence. With every one we slew, it grew angrier, more powerful." Eldridge's brows furrowed. "So there was no killing it?" Isolde nodded. "No. In the end, there was no way to destroy it. We could only contain it. Binding it with ancient magic was the only way. Until now." Eldridge allowed a small smile to curl his lips. "Well, with today's weapons, I'd say we could do some serious damage," he remarked, half in jest, half in genuine hope. Isolde's eyes glinted with faint amusement, but her tone remained grim. "That may be," she said, "but that thing isn't just some beast. It's running on pure primal hatred. It's concentrated evil. I don't know if the spell will be strong enough to contain it this time. It has grown in its anger, its fury, its darkness." Eldridge nodded slowly, his expression turning serious. "Yes, being stuck in this little trap of yours for a few hundred years will do that," he replied, casting a glance around the glowing stones. "It's like leaving a predator to starve. Makes them desperate, makes them crazier." Isolde continued to weave her symbols, her eyes filled with determination. "If this doesn't work," she said quietly, "I don't think there is anyone left who can stop it." Eldridge leaned against one of the stones, folding his arms. "Oh, I know someone who might be able to do the job," he said with a sly grin. "Problem is, he's probably out there saving reality itself. Just a little busy at the moment." Isolde looked at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Who are you talking about?" Eldridge waved a dismissive hand. "Never mind. Let's focus on the task at hand. You're right. We need to hurry if we're to stand any chance of trapping it again." Isolde nodded, her movements becoming quicker, more frantic. "We'll need to hunt it down," she murmured. "Get it back here, to the stones." Eldridge held up a hand, his face a mask of concern. "Hold on a minute," he said, his voice more serious now. "I'm an elder, and even a regular Lycan could tear through me like paper. This big one, it'll rip me in half without breaking a sweat. My powers are useless against it." Isolde glanced over at him, a determined glint in her eyes. "Stay in the shadows," she instructed. "We don't need you to fight it. We need to lure it back to this place, back to the stones where it can be trapped." Eldridge sighed, nodding reluctantly. "Fine, I'll play the bait if I have to, but this better work, Isolde." For a long while, Isolde continued her incantations, the glow of her symbols growing brighter, more intense. The air around them grew colder, the mist thickening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she stopped and exhaled deeply, her face pale and drawn from the effort. "There," she said, a hint of exhaustion in her voice. "The trap is ready." Eldridge looked at the glowing symbols around the stones, feeling the surge of magic in the air. "Now we just need to find that beast and get it to step into your little snare." Isolde nodded, her expression hardening with determination. "If it doesn't work this time," she whispered, "I fear nothing will." Eldritch gave her a sideways glance. "Let's hope it does," he muttered, "because if it doesn't, we're both going to find out just how many pieces that thing can tear us into." They shared a tense look, knowing that the fate of many hung in the balance. With the trap set, they would need to move quickly, and hope that their efforts would be enough to hold back the tide of darkness that was coming. The rain poured down in thick sheets, drumming against the canopy of leaves overhead and turning the forest floor into a slick, treacherous mess. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, growling roar that seemed to echo through the dark woods. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the twisted trunks and gnarled branches, casting jagged shadows across the wet earth. The storm was in full force, and the night seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if the very elements knew the battle that was about to unfold. Isolde turned to Eldritch, her face set with determination. "Lure it here if you can," she instructed, her voice calm despite the tension in the air. "I will confront the beast. Its hatred for me will surely drive it mad, make it reckless. If the beast reaches the circle, you'll see it, and if I lure it, come to my aid as fast as you can. I will come should you be the one to bring it here. There will be much more to do once it is at the stones." Eldritch nodded, a sly smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Good luck, witch." Isolde returned the smile, a rare glint of humour in her eyes. "And you, vampire." With that, they parted ways, each moving in opposite directions through the dark, rain-soaked forest, their footsteps swallowed by the sound of the storm. The woods were dense and foreboding, the rain lashing against the trees with a relentless fury. Eldritch moved like a shadow, his eyes scanning the darkness, his senses heightened. He moved silently, his steps light on the wet ground, his breath steady despite the tension coiling within him. He knew the beast was out there, somewhere, lurking, watching. He had to draw it out, lead it back to the circle. But so far, he found nothing. No tracks, no scent, no sign of movement, just the unending rain and the shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Eldritch paused, listening to the wind, the rustle of leaves, the distant crack of a branch. He could feel the unease creeping in, the realization that the beast was more cunning than he had anticipated. "Where are you, you big bastard?" he muttered under his breath, frustration gnawing at him, but the woods remained silent, save for the storm. Meanwhile, Isolde moved swiftly through the forest, her senses alert, every nerve tingling with anticipation. Her long dark robes were drenched, clinging to her form, her hair plastered against her face by the driving rain. She knew the beast could smell her, that it would sense her presence and come for her. She could feel its hatred, its rage, a black, seething energy that seemed to pulse in the very air. She stepped over a fallen tree, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Come on," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Come for me." And then she felt it, a shift in the air, a prickle of dark energy that sent a shiver down her spine. The beast had caught her scent. A low, guttural howl echoed through the woods, a sound filled with pure, unrestrained fury. Isolde's heart quickened. She knew what was coming. From the shadows, the werewolf burst into view, its eyes glowing red, its massive form moving with terrifying speed. It lunged at her, its claws extended, fangs bared, a roar of rage tearing from its throat. Isolde threw up her hands, and a barrier of light flared into existence, a shimmering wall that deflected the beast's attack. The werewolf slammed into it with a bone-rattling force, snarling in frustration. It recoiled, its eyes narrowing, sensing her magic. "That's it," Isolde whispered, holding her ground, feeling the strain of the defensive spell tugging at her energy. "Come at me." The werewolf lunged again, faster this time, its claws scraping against the barrier, cracking it slightly. Isolde's hands trembled with the effort of maintaining the spell. She could feel the drain on her power, each second weakening her further, while the beast seemed to grow stronger, its anger feeding its strength. She gritted her teeth, her mind racing. She needed to lead it back to the stones, but the beast was relentless. Another attack, this one more vicious. The barrier flickered, and she felt her strength falter. "Not yet," she muttered, her voice strained. "Not here." With a flick of her wrist, she cast a flash spell, a burst of blinding light that filled the forest, illuminating every tree, every shadow. The werewolf howled in pain, its sensitive eyes dazzled, its movements halting for just a moment. Isolde didn't hesitate. She turned and sprinted back toward the stone circle, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, the werewolf shook off the spell's effects, its eyes burning with fury. It roared and took off after her, its massive paws thundering against the ground, tearing through the underbrush, snapping branches in its path. It moved like a force of nature, driven by pure hatred. Isolde ran, her feet slipping in the mud, branches tearing at her robes, her pulse racing. She could hear the beast gaining on her, its growls and snarls growing louder, closer. She pushed herself harder, the stone circle just ahead, the glow of the enchanted runes flickering in the rain. The chase was frantic, desperate. The rain pounded down, lightning flashing overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the trees. Isolde could feel the beast's breath hot on her heels, could feel its hatred like a physical force pushing against her back. She reached the edge of the circle, skidding to a halt on the wet ground. She spun around, her hands raised, ready to cast another spell. The werewolf burst through the trees, its eyes blazing, its muscles tensed, its body coiled like a spring ready to strike. Isolde Blackthorn stood on the other side of the stones, her hands glowing with magic, her face pale but resolute. The beast paused for a fraction of a second, its eyes flicking to the runes, sensing the power in the air. It hesitated, wary, but its rage was too great, too consuming. With a roar, it charged at her, its claws outstretched, its fangs gleaming. As it crossed the threshold of the stone circle, a blinding light erupted from the sky, a column of pure energy that shot down from above, illuminating the entire clearing. The runes around the stones flared to life, glowing with a fierce, blinding intensity. The air crackled with power, the very ground trembling. Eldritch, watching from the shadows, saw the light and knew the trap had been sprung. He raced back toward the circle, moving with inhuman speed, his heart pounding in his chest. He arrived to see the werewolf caught within the stone circle, its massive form thrashing against the invisible chains that held it. The runes pulsed with energy, wrapping around the beast like tendrils of light, tightening with every struggle. Isolde stood on the other side of the circle, her face strained, her voice steady as she continued her incantation. "We must hurry," she said, her eyes meeting Eldritch's as he approached. "He is so strong, stronger than I feared." Eldritch nodded, stepping closer to the edge of the circle, feeling the power in the air, the intensity of the magic. "Let's do this," he said, his voice low but firm, "before it breaks free." Together, they prepared to finish the binding, knowing that this was their only chance. The werewolf roared, its eyes blazing with hatred, its body straining against the magical forces, holding it back. The final battle had begun. Eldritch and Isolde stood at the centre of the ancient stone circle, their breaths ragged, the tension between them almost tangible in the charged air. The runes around them blazed with a fierce, blinding light, the magic crackling and sparking like a living thing. The werewolf, caught within the barrier, thrashed violently, its growls reverberating through the air, a deep, guttural sound filled with rage and hatred. Isolde's voice rose above the storm, clear and commanding, as she began to chant an incantation that seemed to draw the very air around them inward, pulling at the edges of reality itself. Her hands moved in fluid, intricate patterns, summoning the spirits of the fallen Lycans that still lingered near the stones. Bound by ancient oaths and rites, the spirits began to materialize, their forms misty and translucent, their eyes filled with a cold, vengeful light. "Come forth," Isolde commanded, her voice carrying an authority that resonated in the very bones of the earth. "Lend me your strength. Reclaim what was stolen from you." The spirits, sensing the presence of their ancient foe, began to swirl around the werewolf like a spectral wind, their forms solidifying, their faces twisted in anger. They moved with purpose, circling the beast, their hands reaching out like wisps of smoke, clawing at the air around the Lycan. The werewolf roared, snapping at the spirits, its claws swiping through their incorporeal forms. But with each swipe, it seemed to lose a fraction of its strength, its movements becoming slightly more sluggish. The spirits, bound by their anger and pain, sought to reclaim the power that the beast had stolen from them, feeding off its very essence. Eldritch watched, his eyes wide, his face filled with a mix of hope and fear. "This could work," he muttered, feeling a spark of optimism. "We might actually..." But just as everything seemed to be going according to plan, Isolde suddenly screamed in pain, her incantation breaking off into a desperate gasp. She fell to her knees, clutching her side, blood seeping through her fingers. Standing behind her, a shadowy figure stepped forward, Mia, her eyes wild with a mix of triumph and madness, a bloodied knife gleaming in her hand. Maya's smile was feral, a gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. "Be free, my ancestor," she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "Free to exact your revenge." Before Eldritch could react, Mia slipped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as she had appeared. The magic that held the werewolf in place faltered, the glowing runes flickering and fading, the spirits dissipating like mist in the wind. The werewolf paused for a moment, sensing the change, and then it was free, standing tall and unchained in the centre of the stones. Isolde lay motionless on the ground, her face pale, her breath shallow. Eldritch glanced at her, fear clawing at his chest. "Isolde!" he called out, but she didn't move. The werewolf turned its gaze toward Eldritch, its eyes glowing with malice, its teeth bared in a snarling grin. Eldritch felt a chill run down his spine. "Oh dear," he muttered to himself, trying to sound nonchalant, despite the terror creeping up his throat. "Maybe I should have called winter after all." He knew he had to flee, but he also knew that leaving Isolde here would seal her fate. He was helpless against the werewolf. Engaging in a fight with a creature like this would be his demise. But he had to do something. He slipped into his shadow form, merging with the darkness, moving swiftly away from the beast. He emerged a few feet away, taunting it. "Not too bright, are we?" he called out, a mocking smile on his face. The werewolf snarled and lunged at him, but Eldritch slipped back into the shadows just in time, reappearing a few yards away. "Catch me if you can," he taunted again, trying to draw the beast further from Isolde. He repeated the maneuver, again and again, each time moving a little farther, luring the beast away from the stone circle. Eldritch's heart pounded in his chest. "I can't beat you," he said, a forced grin on his lips, "but I can send you on a wild goose chase." The werewolf growled in frustration, its eyes blazing, its focus fixed on Eldritch as he led it deeper into the woods, away from Isolde. But even as he did, he could feel the creature's anger growing, its movements becoming more erratic, more dangerous. He had to keep it distracted, keep it moving. Back at the stones, Isolde groaned in pain, her hand pressing against the deep wound in her back. She could feel the cold creeping in, the darkness edging into her vision. "That was our only chance," she whispered, her voice filled with despair. She managed to cast a small healing spell, feeling a slight relief from the pain, but it was far from enough. Eldritch emerged from the shadows again, hoping to lure the beast further, but the werewolf had vanished. He couldn't see it, couldn't hear it. "Damn," he muttered, his eyes darting around, searching the dark woods. He slipped back into the shadows and raced back to the stone circle in seconds. He found Isolde lying on the ground, her face twisted in pain. "You okay?" he asked, his voice urgent. "No," she replied, her voice weak. "It's bad." "Can't you heal it with a spell or something?" Eldritch asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Isolde shook her head, wincing. "It doesn't work that way," she said. "I need time to heal." Eldritch glanced around, his senses on high alert. "That's one thing we don't have," he said, his tone tense. "I lost him. He could be anywhere." They stood in the dark woods, their eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, every movement in the darkness. The rain poured down, the thunder rolled, and they could feel the fear settling in, the fear of not knowing where the beast was or when it would strike again. The rain continued to pour down in relentless sheets, the storm's fury undiminished. Isolde leaned heavily against one of the ancient stones, her face pale and her breathing laboured. The wound on her back still throbbed with pain, but she remained focused, her senses alert to every sound, every flicker of movement in the shadows around them. "Maybe it's time to call your friend," she said, her voice strained but determined. Eldritch glanced back at her, concern etched across his features. "I will try, but will you be safe?" he asked. Isolde nodded, her expression firm despite the pain. "I can conceal myself. The beast may be able to track my scent, but I should be fine. Just hurry." With a final nod, Eldritch stepped into the shadows, invoking his unique elder ability to traverse great distances by merging with the darkness. The world blurred around him, the storm and the forest melting away into a dark, swirling void. In mere seconds, he reappeared at the entrance of Winter's estate, the grand structure looming against the stormy sky. Eldritch rushed to the heavy wooden door and raised his hand to knock, but before he could, the door swung open. Standing in the doorway was Mara, a woman in her late 40s, with short brown hair and sharp brown eyes that immediately fixed on him with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Eldritch, is that you?" she asked, her tone a mix of surprise and caution. "Yes, it's me," Eldritch replied urgently. "I have little time, Mara. I need Winter." Mara's expression shifted to one of worry. "Winter's off holding back some demon from breaching reality. I don't know when he'll be back," she explained. Eldritch's face tightened with frustration. "The Alpha?" he asked, his voice edged with urgency. "He's with him," Mara confirmed, her voice steady but apologetic. Eldritch cursed under his breath, a low growl of frustration escaping his lips. "Damn it, Mara. This is urgent. I have to go. I'll need to find another way," he muttered, turning to leave. "Wait," Mara called out, catching his arm. "You know, he's still in the den," she said, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Simon thinks he's too unstable to help, but I'm sure he'd want to. might be your best bet." Eldritch hesitated. "You're sure he won't kill me?" he asked, half joking, half serious. Mara shrugged with a wry smile. "No, but I think he likes you." Eldritch nodded, taking a deep breath before heading towards the den, a dark, cavernous space beneath the estate where the most dangerous and unpredictable werewolves were kept under Simon's watchful eye. He descended into the shadows cautiously, his senses sharp. "You in here, Dimitri? Duke, or whatever you'd like me to call you," he called out, his voice echoing in the dim, humid space. "Sir, if you prefer, but I really could use your help." The ground trembled slightly as massive footsteps approached. Each step making the stone walls shudder. From the darkness emerged Dimitri, the Alpha Prime, a towering figure of raw primal power. His fur was as dark as midnight, his eyes glowing a fierce yellow, filled with an untamed and feral intelligence. Eldritch felt a wave of fear surge up his spine, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. "Ah, Dimitri, so great to see you," Eldritch stammered, forcing a smile despite the terror gripping his chest. "I have this little issue, you see. Seems another Lycan, a big one, wants to kill me. Can't imagine why. And well, I know you're the Alpha, the Lycan Prime. I could use your assistance." Dimitri's eyes bore into Eldritch's, and after a tense moment, the massive Lycan gave a slow, deliberate nod. Eldritch exhaled in relief. "I'll have to take you into the shadows to get there," he said cautiously, stepping closer. Dimitri nodded again, his enormous form looming over Eldritch, his presence radiating a powerful authority. Eldritch reached out and touched Dimitri's arm, feeling the raw strength coursing through him. Concentrating, he merged them both into the shadows, the darkness enveloping them as they travelled back to the stones in a matter of seconds. They emerged at the edge of the stone circle, the storm still raging around them, lightning splitting the sky. Eldritch stumbled slightly, but Dimitri stood tall, his piercing yellow eyes scanning the area with a predatory gaze. Isolde looked up, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the massive Lycan Prime. She straightened herself, despite the pain. This is who can stop the beast?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Another beast? We could end up fighting two instead of one." Eldritch raised a calming hand. "Wait, this is the Alpha Prime. He's not just another beast. He's the Lycan Prime. He will help us." Isolde's eyes flicked between Eldritch and Dimitri, uncertainty still evident in her expression. She knew there was no time to debate. The rogue Lycan was somewhere out there, and if Dimitri was their best hope, she had to trust Eldritch's judgment. Dimitri stepped forward, his immense frame casting a shadow over the stone circle, his presence radiating power and dominance. Eldritch felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. They had brought back a force that might just be enough to confront the rogue Lycan, a force with the strength of the original Alpha's bloodline. As the storm raged on, the Alpha Prime stood tall in the center of the stone circle, ready to face the battle that was to come. The storm raged on, rain pouring down like a relentless curtain from the heavens, lightning crackling across the darkened sky. Dimitri, the Alpha Prime, stood still for a moment, his massive form tense, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air, his yellow eyes narrowing to slits. The scent of the rogue Lycan, mingled with rain and earth, filled his senses, igniting a primal instinct deep within him. With a low, rumbling growl, Dimitri glanced at Eldritch, his gaze intense and almost challenging. Eldritch felt a shiver run down his spine, understanding the unspoken command. Before Eldritch could speak, Dimitri darted off into the dark woods, a blur of speed and raw power. "I think he wants us to wait here," Eldritch murmured, watching as Dimitri vanished into the shadows, his heart pounding. He turned to Isolde, who was still leaning against the stones, her wound barely held at bay by her magic. Isolde nodded, her face tense. "Let's hope he knows what he's doing," she whispered, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the stone circle. Dimitri moved through the dark, rain-soaked forest like a spectre, his movements swift and silent, his senses heightened to their fullest. He was an ancient, powerful beast, the Alpha Prime, father to Winter's own Alpha. His story was one of legend, filled with blood and darkness, from his cursed beginnings to the havoc he had wrought upon mankind. In a different reality, Dimitri had unleashed an apocalypse on the world of men, leading the Lycans in a war that nearly brought about the end of humanity. He had revelled in the carnage, in the fear and chaos, fulfilling the primal rage that burned within him. But that reality had been reset, undone by Winter's power, and Dimitri had found a new path. He had joined Winter and his son, Winter's Alpha, knowing happiness and peace for the first time in his long, brutal existence. Yet the primal force within him, the need to be an Alpha, had never been fully tamed. Today, that ancient hunger stirred again, and perhaps this day would see Dimitri reclaim his true nature, become the Alpha once more. The forest around him seemed to shrink back in fear as he passed, the rain hissing against his fur, the lightning illuminating his dark, formidable form. He moved like a shadow, his eyes scanning the darkness, his ears pricked for any sound, any sign of his prey. The scent of the rogue Lycan was growing stronger, sharper, filled with rage and defiance. Dimitri's lips curled back into a snarl. He could sense the creature's challenge, its desire to dominate, to overthrow him. The darkness was thick, almost tangible, the storm muffling sound and obscuring sight. Dimitri moved with purpose, his muscles coiled and ready, his mind focused on the hunt. This rogue Lycan was different. It did not recognize his authority, did not bow to his command. It sought to take his place as the Alpha, to challenge him in a way no other Lycan had dared. Dimitri's primal instincts flared, and a low growl rumbled deep in his throat. He could feel the old rage boiling to the surface, the bloodlust that had driven him to war and destruction so many centuries ago. The forest seemed to vibrate with his presence, the rain falling harder, the thunder rumbling louder, as if the very elements sensed the confrontation that was about to unfold. Then, in the darkness ahead, he caught a flicker of movement. His sharp eyes focused, his ears twitched, and he saw the rogue Lycan. It was massive, almost matching Dimitri in size, its fur bristling with fury, its eyes glowing with a fierce, unnatural light. The rogue had sensed him, picking up his scent on the wind. They stood across from each other in the dark, the rain pouring between them, steam rising from their heated breath. Dimitri let out a deafening roar, a command that all Lycans should obey. His voice was like thunder, echoing through the trees, a proclamation of his dominance. He was the Alpha Prime, the original, the father of all Lycans. In his presence, they should submit, bow, or flee. But the rogue Lycan did not bow. Its lips curled back into a snarl, revealing long, jagged teeth, its eyes filled with a burning defiance. This Lycan was different. It would not obey. It sought dominance over all things, even the Alpha Prime. It wanted to take Dimitri's place, to claim his title, to be the alpha above all. Dimitri's eyes narrowed, a deep, guttural growl emanating from his chest. He could see the madness in the rogue's eyes, the consuming desire for power. This was not just a hunt. This was a challenge, an attempt to overthrow him, to claim what had always been his. The rogue Lycan lunged forward, its muscles rippling under its matted fur, its claws extended, its teeth bared. Dimitri crouched low, his own claws digging into the wet earth, his muscles tensing for the inevitable clash. He roared again, louder this time, his voice filled with both anger and authority. He would not allow this upstart to take what was his. The two Lycans met in a flurry of fur, teeth, and claws, the impact sending shockwaves through the forest floor. Dimitri's strength was immense, his movements fluid and controlled, but the rogue was fast, agile, driven by an insatiable hunger for dominance. They clashed again and again, each strike sending echoes through the trees, the storm raging around them as if responding to their fury. Dimitri's mind was clear, focused, the old instincts coming back with every blow, every dodge. He was the Alpha Prime, and he would not be defeated. But he could see the rogue's determination, its refusal to submit. This was no ordinary Lycan. It was something more, something that should not exist, and it would not stop until one of them lay dead. Dimitri bared his teeth, his eyes blazing in the darkness. The rogue Lycan snarled, its eyes burning with hatred and ambition, and charged again. Dimitri braced himself, knowing that this battle would not end quickly, that it might be the fight that defined his existence. The storm raged on, lightning flashing, illuminating the two massive figures locked in combat, the primal battle between Alpha and Usurper. The two beasts faced each other, their eyes locked in a primal challenge. Dimitri, the Alpha Prime, could sense something different, something unsettling about this rogue Lycan before him. This was no ordinary werewolf. It was something darker, something twisted by an unnatural power. Dimitri's instincts flared, sensing the malevolent energy that radiated from the creature. The rogue werewolf had absorbed the powers of its own pack to enhance its strength, drawing their essence into itself. The darkness had sent the beast deep into the arms of evil, its soul tainted by the power it had consumed. Dimitri could feel the corruption that lay within it, a monstrous force that had become something more than just a mere werewolf. Centuries ago, this rogue had been known as Malakar, a warlock with a dark heart, who had once crossed paths with Isolde. Obsessed with power, Malakar had sought a way to transcend his mortal limits. He had allowed himself to be bitten by another Lycan, deliberately taking on the curse. But Malakar was no ordinary man. He had woven a spell around himself, a curse upon a curse, allowing him to absorb the powers of any Lycan he felled, their strength and abilities feeding his own. Now he stood before Dimitri, hungering for the ultimate prize, the power of the Alpha Prime. Malakar's eyes glinted with malevolent ambition, and Dimitri knew that the rogue would not stop until he had claimed his place as the new Alpha. The two werewolves lunged at each other, a violent collision of fur, claws, and teeth. The ground beneath them trembled with the force of their clash. Dimitri's muscles strained as he pushed back against the rogue Lycan's assault, but he could feel the power coursing through Malakar, a strength that seemed to swell with every strike. Malakar had the strength of many Lycans within him, and with each blow he drew on their combined might. The rogue werewolf fought with a relentless fury, his blows coming harder and faster, driving Dimitri back. Dimitri could feel the difference. Malakar was using the power he had stolen from countless Lycans, drawing on their strength to overwhelm him. For a moment, Dimitri felt his own strength faltering, the weight of Malakar's power pressing down on him like a crushing wave. But then Dimitri felt it. Something deep within himself, a stirring, an ancient force that awakened in his core. He realized that no single Lycan could deny the call of the Alpha Prime, whether living or dead. Malakar had consumed their strength, but he had not accounted for the primal connection that bound all Lycans to their true Alpha. Dimitri threw back his head and let out a howl that cut through the storm. A primal call that echoed across the forest, reaching into the very essence of every Lycan soul, commanding them to obey. It was a call that no werewolf could deny, a summons from the Alpha Prime that reverberated through the fabric of existence itself. One by one, Dimitri could feel the souls of the Lycans trapped within Malakar begin to stir, struggling against the dark magic that bound them. The rogue werewolf's body jerked and convulsed, his eyes wide with surprise and fear as he felt his control slipping. The power within him began to wane, the stolen strength starting to ebb away. Malakar growled in desperation, trying to hold on to the power he had taken, but it was no use. The souls of the Lycans began to wrestle free, tearing themselves away from the rogue's grasp, their essence responding to Dimitri's call. With each soul that broke free, Malakar weakened, his form shrinking, his strength fading. Finally, the last of the stolen power left Malakar's body, and he stood before Dimitri as nothing more than an ordinary werewolf, panting and blooded, his eyes wide with fear. Dimitri towered over him, his claws raised, ready to strike. Rage burned in his heart, rage for the lives Malakar had destroyed, for the evil he had wrought, for the defiance against the natural order. He could end this here and now, destroy Malakar for what he had done. But then, a memory surged through Dimitri's mind, a memory from long ago that made his heart falter. The memory. The vision took Dimitri back to that fateful night when he had first transformed into the Alpha, consumed by grief and fury. It was the night when he had lost Elena, the woman he loved, brutally murdered by those who had hunted him, those who had wronged him. The pain was unbearable, a fire that burned through his soul, fueling his transformation into something monstrous. He remembered the way his heart had pounded in his chest, the primal scream that tore from his throat as his body convulsed, bones breaking and reforming, fur sprouting from his skin, the raw power that surged through him as he became the Alpha for the first time, an unstoppable force, driven by a singular desire for revenge. He had torn through the village, his senses overwhelmed by the scent of blood and fear. His vision had turned red with rage as he hunted down those responsible, one by one, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. In those moments, Dimitri had become the very embodiment of primal hatred, a beast with no thought beyond his thirst for vengeance. The screams of the villagers, the crackle of flames as homes burned, the splatter of blood on his claws, these memories surged back with vivid clarity. He remembered the feeling of satisfaction as he watched the life drain from his enemies, the way the rage within him had seemed insatiable, even after the last of his foes had fallen. Yet, as the bloodlust ebbed, what remained was a hollow emptiness. The vengeance he had sought had not brought him peace. Instead, it had only deepened his sorrow, trapping him in a cycle of rage and regret. He had become the very monster they had feared, a vessel of primal hatred that knew no bounds. Returned to the present, Dimitri's gaze softened as he stared down at the rogue werewolf beneath him. He could see the same madness in Malakar's eyes, the same torment that had once driven him. In that moment, Dimitri saw not just an enemy, but a reflection of his own tortured soul, a being lost to the very curse that had consumed them both. His claws hovered inches from Malakar's throat, trembling as the memory of his own past washed over him. Dimitri's heart pounded in his chest, but now it was with a different emotion, an emotion he had not felt in centuries. Compassion. The primal rage that had driven him moments before began to wane, replaced by a deep sense of understanding. Dimitri saw that it was not the beast, but the man, the evil warlock, who had enslaved this creature for his own gain. The beast was the one who had been caged by the warlock's dark magic. The flashback faded, and Dimitri found himself back in the present. He withdrew his claws, stepping back from the rogue werewolf, his mind racing with the weight of his decision. Malachar, panting and bloodied, stared up at him in confusion, the hatred in his eyes flickering with uncertainty. Dimitri, breathing heavily, howled, a primal call to banish the man and free the beast within Malachar. It was a howl that resonated deep within the rogue werewolf, awakening the beast and purging the warlock's dark influence. A brief, fierce battle raged within Malachar's soul, but the alpha's call was too strong. Slowly, the warlock's spirit was cast out, leaving only the beast behind, a creature loyal to the Alpha Prime. For the first time in centuries, Dimitri chose mercy over vengeance, not out of weakness, but out of the wisdom hard-earned through his own suffering. As he stood over the defeated werewolf, Dimitri realized that breaking the cycle of hatred was the only way to find redemption for them both. The battle was over, but the true challenge had only just begun. Dimitri knew that sparing Malachar would change everything, but it was a risk he was finally willing to take for himself, for Malachar, and for the hope of a different future. Dimitri emerged from the darkness of the forest into the clearing of the stone circle, his massive form silhouetted against the dim light of the stormy sky. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and ozone. Eldritch and Isolde stood by the ancient stones, their faces tense, waiting for news of the battle. Eldritch's eyes widened as he saw the Alpha Prime approach, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. "What happened?" Eldritch shouted, his voice edged with both concern and urgency. Before Dimitri could respond, another figure appeared from the shadows behind him, the rogue werewolf, its eyes lowered, its posture submissive. Eldritch and Isolde tensed, their bodies immediately ready for a fight. But Dimitri, sensing their alarm, let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that cut through the tension like a knife. The rogue werewolf immediately bowed its head, its ears flattening against its skull, its body crouching low in a posture of submission. It made no move to attack, no sign of aggression. Isolde's eyes narrowed, but she could feel the change in the air, the shift in the creature's aura. She lowered her hands slowly, the glow fading as she realized what had occurred. "The warlock, he's gone," she murmured, sensing the absence of the dark presence that had once inhabited the werewolf. Eldritch, still wary. "So, it's over?" he asked, his voice quieter now, searching Dimitri's face for confirmation. Dimitri gave a curt nod, and then turned to the werewolf beside him. The creature remained in its submissive stance, showing no signs of resistance or rebellion. Dimitri let out another low growl, more of a rumble in his chest, and the werewolf responded by lowering itself even further, its head almost touching the ground, a gesture of loyalty and respect to the Alpha Prime. Isolde stepped forward, her eyes softening as she looked at Dimitri. "You spared him," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of surprise and understanding. "You broke the cycle." Dimitri nodded again, his expression calm but firm, his eyes meeting hers with a depth of emotion rarely seen. A silence fell over the clearing, the rain now just a soft whisper against the leaves. Eldritch, exhaling a breath he hadn't realised he'd been holding. "Well, I suppose that's that," he said, trying to mask his relief with a casual tone. "You heading back to your den with your new recruit?" Dimitri glanced at the werewolf beside him, who remained in its humble stance, and then gave a short nod. Isolde smiled, a gentle warmth in her expression. "Good," she said. "He deserves a chance, just like anyone else." Dimitri inclined his head toward her in a respectful nod. Eldritch turned to Isolde, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "So, I suppose this is where we part ways," he said, his tone lighter. "Back to my own shadows, I guess." Isolde chuckled softly. "Not quite," she replied. "I think I'll stick around this timeline a bit longer. I find I like the company." Eldritch raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Well, I can't say I blame you," he said with a grin. "This timeline does have its moments." They exchanged a nod, a silent understanding passing between them. Isolde knew that the future was uncertain, but she felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. Dimitri turned, leading the rogue werewolf away from the clearing, back toward the dense woods where his den lay hidden among the shadows. The werewolf followed obediently, its head still bowed, its posture respectful. For the first time in centuries, Dimitri felt a sense of calm settle over him, a quiet resolution that soothed the turmoil in his soul. He had chosen a different path, one that did not lead to vengeance or hatred, but to understanding and change. And as the Alpha Prime, he knew that this decision would echo through the generations of Lycans that followed, a reminder that even the fiercest of beasts could choose mercy over rage. Eldritch watched them go, then turned back to Isolde. "Well," he said with a sigh, "I guess we should get out of this rain." Isolde smiled. "Yes, let's..." As they walked away from the ancient stones, the rain began to taper off, and a sliver of moonlight broke through the clouds. The storm had passed, and with it, a new chapter had begun, for them all. And so, they moved forward, leaving the shadows of the past behind, stepping into whatever light the future might bring. Epilogue. A shadow in the night. The city was quiet under the cover of darkness, the streets slick with recent rain, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the occasional drip of water from the rooftops. In a small, cramped apartment, a woman frantically stuffed belongings into a backpack, her hands trembling as she glanced nervously at the clock on the wall. She moved with urgency, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She knew she needed to leave, and fast. Pulling on a worn jacket, she grabbed her keys and darted out the door, descending the stairs 2 at a time. The night air was cold as she stepped outside, her footsteps echoing in the narrow alleyway. She hurried toward her car, parked under a flickering street lamp, the shadows around her seeming to pulse with a life of their own. She slipped into the driver's seat, her hands shaking as she jammed the key into the ignition. She turned it, but nothing happened. The engine sputtered, then fell silent. "Damn it!" she hissed, pounding the steering wheel in frustration. Her heart pounded in her chest, her eyes darting around, searching the dark street. Then, in the distance, she saw it. A figure, dark and shadowy, standing just beyond the circle of light cast by the street lamp. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't make out any features, only the silhouette, a tall, menacing form that seemed to be watching her. Fear gripped her. She threw open the car door and bolted, her feet slapping against the wet pavement. She ran blindly, her breath coming in desperate gasps, her mind racing. The shadow figure moved, gliding silently, effortlessly in pursuit. The city seemed to close in around her, the buildings tall and foreboding, the alleys twisting into a maze. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud in her ears, feel the cold air biting at her skin. She glanced back, her eyes wide with terror, and saw the figure still following, gaining ground. She turned a corner, skidding slightly on the wet pavement, and found herself in a narrow alley, a dead end looming ahead. Her eyes darted around, searching for a way out, but there was none. She was trapped. She turned, for the first time revealing her face in the dim light. It was Mia. Her eyes were wide with fear, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "No, no," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was just respecting my ancestors." The shadow figure stepped forward, emerging from the darkness with a quiet, predatory grace. Eldritch. His face was impassive, his eyes dark and cold. He took a slow step toward her, his presence filling the narrow alleyway with a suffocating sense of menace. "Yes," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of cold amusement. "I've heard it so many times. I was just following orders." Mia's face twisted with fear, her eyes darting for any escape, but there was none. The darkness seemed to close in around her, the shadow of Eldritch looming larger, his expression unchanging, relentless. The lights of the city stretching out into the distance. Then, a piercing scream echoed through the night. Chilling, desperate, and then silence.